We're in 1 Samuel chapter 14. Jonathan, remember Jonathan and his armor bearer, just two men, have embarked on a two-man operation against a gigantic Philistine encampment. This great big Philistine army. And Jonathan and his armor bearer have decided one night, we need to go in there and we need to stir things up. God has raised up the king, my father, to defeat the Philistines. God said that very clearly through Samuel. But we're not defeating the Philistines. We're just sitting here watching. Something needs to occur. So Jonathan moves out with his armor bearer, and his armor bearer says, whatever you say, I'll do. So Jonathan has the faith of the armor bearer. He'll follow Jonathan to the death. We pick up in verse 13, just to get back into the story. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 13, it says, Then Jonathan climbed upon his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him. Remember, they were climbing a crag, a cliff, to get to the Philistine encampment. So he climbed up on his hands and feet, his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan. So Jonathan engages them not in conversation. He's a good, strong Jew. He engages them in battle. He gets up and he engages the Philistines in battle. No concern for how many there might be. No counting, no sending out for anything. He immediately engages them in battle. It says they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. As I said last week, it seems maybe probable that they were coming at Jonathan from all directions, and he and his armor bearer were back to back, taking out those that were coming to try to kill them. Verse 14 says that first slaughter, because it is a slaughter when two men kill 20, that's a slaughter. When two men kill two, that's normal battle, but when two men kill 20, that's a slaughter. It says that first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men, so it could have been slightly more than 20 men, about 20 men within about half a furrow in an acre of land. So two Jewish men are attacked by these Philistines, or maybe the Jews attack the Philistines. It doesn't really matter. They are in battle at the top of this crag. And that two Jews killing 20 Philistines is enough to panic an enemy. In verse 15, it says there was a trembling in the camp. This is the camp of the Philistines. It's not Jonathan and his armor bearer that are trembling. It's the Philistine army that's trembling. There was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled. So not only the Philistines, but the army, everybody of the Philistines that was in the area was horrified. They were terrified of what was going on, that these Jews with such a small force had attacked them. And then we see Yahweh involve himself in the fighting directly. It says, and the earth quaked. So God, Yahweh, causes a mild earthquake here to further unnerve these Philistine army, the garrison and all the army and the people. Yahweh involves himself. It says in the earthquake so that it became a great trembling. There is terrifying fear coursing through the Philistines because, as I said as we closed last time, the Philistines would have interpreted this earthquake as the God of Israel versus the God of the Philistines, Dagon. We see this tension again, this Satan versus God tension. I'm telling you, you see it on every page of the Bible. I say this because we've been talking about this in our night sessions, this tension between Satan and the God of the Bible, Yahweh, and you see it here. The Philistines were a very, very religious people. They worshipped a lot of false satanic gods. And Dagon was one of their gods. Remember the story when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. They took it to the temple of Dagon and they put it in there as if to offer their god Dagon just a victory piece, a trophy for having defeated the God of Israel. And what happened that night? Dagon fell. So the Philistines have to wake up in the morning and lift up their God. Can you imagine having a God that you have to help to his feet? They have to lift up their god Dagon before the ark of Yahweh, and again the next day Dagon has fallen, but this time his hands and his head are fallen off of him, have been broken off of him by Yahweh. His power is completely gone. He never had any. He's imaginary. But the fact is, this tension, this Satan versus God, this false god pantheon versus the one true God's on every page of this book. And here you see it again. But the Philistines, having remembered that event, were terrified when the earth quaked. No one can make an earthquake except for Yahweh or Dagon in their thinking. And so the fact that they were being slaughtered by two helpless Jewish men, the fact that two Jews were killing a Philistine army that numbered like the sand of the seashore, had the Philistine army realizing Yahweh is at war with us here. And when the earth quaked, they knew it. It terrified them. They were a deeply religious people. So Jonathan and his armor bearer here each have single-handedly changed this war. They've begun the war, and they have called, because of their efforts, their motivations, their proper thinking, their alignment with Yahweh's desire to defeat and kill the Philistines. Yahweh has engaged himself in this battle, and he did that because of the heroism of these two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer. Now keep that in mind when we get to the end of the story, and Saul wants to kill Israel's hero, Jonathan. It's because of what he's done. The people know that Yahweh has fought with Jonathan, not with him, alongside him, not against him, but alongside him. And the Jews know that, and we'll see that at the end of the story. Yet what does Saul want to do to Jonathan? He wants to kill him because he ate some honey. It's an astonishingly ironic story when you get through it and get to the end of it. But Yahweh acts mightily on Israel's behalf because of these two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer. So we ask the question, how will Saul then, the king of Israel, Jonathan's father, how will Saul react to this event? What should he do? What has God called Jonathan what has God called Saul to be the king of Israel to do? What's the very first thing? I showed you the verse last week. I reminded you of it, that God wanted Saul to do as the king of Israel. Concerning the Philistines, I'll make it easier. What did he want him to do? Destroy the Philistines. Kill the Philistines. And here you have Jonathan, who's gone out to kill the Philistines, and his father, King Saul, who received the order to kill the Philistines, doing nothing. Remember, sitting under his tree. So what should Saul do? How should Saul react? He should follow his son Jonathan into battle. He should do what God called him to do, and he should annihilate these Philistines. But what does he do? It always seems that when Saul should be acting, that he's doing something different. He's inactive. When he should be active, he's passive. When he should be passive, he's active. Always seems like he's doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Verse 16, Saul's watchmen in Gibeah. So Saul's got watchmen, and they're looking out from high places. Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away. Who's the multitude? It's the Philistine army. They're looking out on the Philistine army, and the watchman can see that this army is melting away, almost like you put a stick in an ant pile, and the ants just come out of that pile and they start wandering away from the pile. That's what the watchmen are seeing. The Philistine army is running. There's all kinds of problems in the camp. There's all this erratic behavior, but the multitude is melted away, and they went here and there like those ants. They're completely terrified. They don't know what to do. And here we have in verse 17, how does Saul react? What does Saul want to do? What would you do if you were a general and the army that you were fighting against was in total chaos and disarray? What is that a moment to do? Attack. attack the enemy. They're in disarray, they're chaotic, they're not orderly. Attack the enemy, Saul. That's what God wants you to do. Kill the Philistines. But what does Saul do? He does two things here. Verse 17, Saul said to the people who were with him, not attack, but number now, count the soldiers, the 600 men, and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul knows something has caused this chaos in the Philistine camp. They weren't like that the night before, but now they are like that. What has happened? And what does Saul do? But count his army. It doesn't matter how it's occurred. Yahweh wants this. Yahweh wants the Philistine army defeated. He's stirred up the Philistine army. It makes you wonder, that's why I say a mild earthquake. It makes you wonder whether Saul even felt the earthquake. Probably not, because it didn't get his attention. And so instead of attacking the army, he wants to know which of Israel's soldiers caused this stir, because something had to happen. Verse 18. So now he knows it's Jonathan. It's my son and his armor bearer that have started this. So instead of saying, let's attack, Jonathan's there. Jonathan is leading this charge. Jonathan's a godly man. Instead of going in to finalize this battle, in verse 18 we see Saul do something else instead of leading his troops into battle. Saul said to Ahiah, remember Ahiah is the priest, he said, bring the ark of God here. Now, in some translations, some of your books may say, bring the ephod here. Anybody's book say ephod instead of ark? Some translations in the Septuagint, I won't say much about the Septuagint, but about 200 years before Jesus came to earth, the Jews decided that we need to have a Bible not in the Hebrew language, but in the Greek language. We need the Old Testament written in Greek because we speak Greek now, and so do all our children. Let's have a Bible, an Old Testament Bible written in Greek, and that's what the Septuagint is, the Septuagint. The LXX, you may see it sometimes. Well, the LXX has this word translated ephod, the robe, the white linen ephod that the priest would wear. So it could be that it's just the high priest's ephod that Saul called into battle here. But it also could be that he wanted the very Ark of the Covenant brought to him. Anybody know where the Ark is? Think about where the ark is for just a minute. Let's read this verse. Saul says to Ahiah, bring the ark of God here. He wants to question God. He wants to find out from God what's going on. God has already told him what to do. Kill the Philistines. Why, Gideon? Doesn't it remind you of some of these stories? Why do you need the fleece wet or the fleece dry? I've already made my decree and my command. But here we have Saul wanting to bring the ark of God, for the ark of God at that time was with the sons of Israel. In verse 19 it says, while Saul talked to the priest, what should he be doing? Leading his army in battle, but he's buying himself more time here, it seems. Saul talked to the priest, that's Ahiah. While Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued. So this erosion of the Philistine army is still going on. Saul sees it. His watchmen see it. And because of the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continuing and increasing, Saul says to the priest, withdraw your hand. So, a couple things to talk about here. Saul tells the priest to withdraw his hand. And that's why it very well could be that all Saul called up was the ephod. Remember what was on the front of the ephod? It was a breastplate. It had the 12 stones on it, each stone representing one of the tribes of Israel. But behind that plate, there was a pocket. And inside that pocket is where the priest would put his hands, where the Urim and the Thummim were, that were these stones. We're not exactly sure. God doesn't give us enough in the Bible to know exactly how these stones worked. But this is how the high priest would determine what God's will was. What do you want me to do? The king would ask the priest would turn to the Urim and Thummim. We don't know if they changed colors, if one got hot, one got cold. We do not know, the Bible doesn't tell us, but we know that it was behind that breastplate of righteousness where these stones were. And so as Saul continues to see that the army of the Philistines is increasing in their commotion and erratic behavior, Saul tells the priest, now imagine this. The priest is already in the throes of finding out what Yahweh's will is for this day, for this battle, for Saul. He has his hands behind his breastplate. He's engaging with the Urim and Thummim. And instead of allowing the priest to get a word from the Lord through these stones, Saul says, take your hands out. I already know what I need to know. Why on earth? Saul, please stop being who you are. Saul tells the priest, withdraw your hand. I don't need a word from the Lord. It's an amazing thing. It's almost as if Saul knew enough already from seeing the Philistine army that he didn't want to bother God with any direct communication. I have no idea what what his motivations were to tell the priest, stop communing with God. But that's exactly what he did when he said, withdraw your hands. He didn't seek Yahweh's will or Yahweh's blessing here. That's King Saul for you. I asked a minute ago, anyone remember where the Ark of the Covenant is? Remember the Philistines had taken the Ark? They won it in battle. They didn't win it, they stole it. And it stayed in Philistia for some 7 months. Finally, they took the 2 milk cows and the new cart, and they brought the Ark of the Covenant. They let the milk cows go to see where they would go. They came into the land of Israel. Israel was afraid of the cart. Israel was not the cart, but the Ark. And so they finally moved the Ark to this place, where it stayed for almost 100 years. Until David went to get the ark away from this place, this is where it was. So if, this is just a point of interest, if Saul were to have called the Ark of the Covenant, they would have gone to this man's house to get it, because this is where it was. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, the men of Kiriath Yearim came, and they took the ark of the Lord and they brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill. That's where the ark was. It was in the house of this man, Abinadab. And they consecrated Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. From that day, or from the day that the ark remained at Kiriath Yearim, the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh. That was 20 years until 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 3 occurred and Samuel started moving Israel. But it would stay there for another 80 years after that until David went to get it. So if Saul called the ark to the battlefield, this is where they went to pick it up, and afterwards this is where it went back to the house of Abinadab, which means my father is noble, at Kiriath Yearim. Verse 19, while Saul talked to the priest, it's the same verse again. While Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. So it seems to me that Saul knew everything from continuing watching the battle, that killing the Philistines was the right thing to do. I just need to lead my troops into battle. Let's not bother with God right now. Withdraw your hand, O high priest of Israel. I'll do this on my own. Seems to be what he's doing. So Saul and his 600 men finally enter into the battle after Saul wants this census of the army. Let's find out who's missing, as if it matters. And then Saul calls the priest, but instead of following through with the priest all the way to the end, Saul calls the priest, waits for the priest, has the priest puts his hand in his ephod, and then says, forget it. I know what I'm going to do. That's exactly who King Saul is and what he's doing here. So Saul and his 600 men finally enter the battle, but not before Saul puts the people under this horrible, foolish oath. I want to show you the oath first while we read these verses so you'll know what's going on. Saul's men, his 600 men, are finally moving out into battle against this chaotic Philistine ant pile that's been stirred up. But look what Saul makes the people swear to before he sends them out into battle. And we'll read this in just a couple of minutes, this oath. It says, the men of Israel were hard pressed, which is a Hebrew word that means fatigued. They were exhausted. The men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul, another foolish thing, for Saul had put the people, his army, under an oath. And this was the oath that he made his men say, or that he made his men take. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies. Me. I, myself, my enemies. Saul is so completely self-absorbed. This is all about him. And so instead of looking out for his army, sending proper food provisions for his army so that they could remain strong throughout this day's battle, what Saul does is just the opposite. No one will eat until I am avenged. I mean, you can see this crazed lunatic, self-absorbed man saying, this battle is about me and the Philistines, and no man will eat food until they have been defeated and I have been avenged. So what does it say? So none of the people tasted food. Now we can move into verse 20. We'll talk more about that oath in just a minute. I just want you to know this part of the story before we see Saul's army enter battle, because this is all about that oath not to eat food. How can you tell someone you're going to send out into battle? The hardest, the thing probably that would take the most energy out of a man. He's fearful, he's nervous. I mean, I've never been in battle, but I can only imagine the adrenaline rush, everything that's going on in a man who's fighting for his life, for your king to say, oh, by the way, you can't eat today. Insanity. So verse 20, Saul and his army finally entered the battle. It says, then Saul and all the people who were with him, remember there are about 600 men with him, they rallied and they came to the battle. And behold, every Philistine, you could add the word Philistine, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great commotion. What we have here is the Philistines are killing each other. And you see this, God kills people this way. He's done this several times, and He'll do this in several battles throughout the rest of the Old Testament. He'll cause so much confusion in the enemy camp that they will turn on each other and kill each other with their own swords. The Israelites don't do this. There were more people killed by killing each other than the Israelites killed. God has caused this through the confusion and the fear. It says, behold, every man's sword was against his own fellow, his fellow countrymen. The Philistines are killing the Philistines. There was a great confusion. Can you imagine being Saul and his army coming up to this confusion and wondering, what do we do here? What should we do? Why would we enter into battle if the enemies are killing each other? Why would we enter into this foray? We get to see what happens here. In verse 21 it says, now the Hebrews, this is an interesting group of people. Tell me who these people are. Hebrews are Jews. Israel, Jew, Hebrew, all these words speak of the same people. But in verse 21, here's an interesting group of Hebrew Jews. It says, now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with the Philistines all around in the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites, or the Hebrews, who were with Saul and Jonathan. Who were these people? It says the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously. What does that mean? But they were on the same team. There were Hebrew Jews fighting with the Philistines against the Israeli army. So you only really have two choices here. These were either Jews who were deserters, who deserted Israel to go fight alongside the enemy, or these were Jewish mercenaries. You know what a mercenary is? A mercenary is a paid soldier. Maybe you have in some of these Jews, hey, we could make some money here. the jury's out. You make your own decision who they were. But they were either cowardly deserters of their own countrymen, Israel, or at worst, they were mercenaries, men who were taking a paycheck from the Philistines to fight beside them against Israel. Maybe even spy types. Whichever they were, they changed their support from the Philistines back to Saul and the Israelites when they realized, wow, we're going to win this battle. We are going to defeat the Philistines. Oh, Israel. Remember, this is the latter end of the days of the judges when Saul now has become king. Israel is horribly idolatrous, following all and worshiping all the pantheon of false gods. So what would have compelled Jews to turn against their own countrymen and fight with an enemy army? Only God knows. But that's the only verse we have about it right there. Verse 22 says, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves. Now we have another group of Jewish men. When all the men of Israel, these are Hebrews, these are Jews, who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in battle. So now we have this group of Jews that were so fearful to fight against the Philistines that they were hiding themselves. We saw it in an earlier verse, in caves and holes and thickets and all these different places. When they see that the Jews are having success against the Philistines, even these cowards come out of their holes and their caves, and they fight now. Israel was in a terrible way. Saul, the great king that they wanted, was not leading them in battle the way they expected him to. And Israel is just in chaos. But what do we see in verse 23? While Israel is disintegrating, while their political system is breaking down, while their leader, the king, has lost the faith of the men to follow him into battle, what do we see about Yahweh? Ever faithful. Ever faithful. Yahweh delivered Israel on that day. Did they deserve the deliverance? No. Do they ever deserve the deliverance? Really, no. But what does Yahweh do? He delivered Israel on that day. And here we have to start thinking again about the lack of food. And Saul's stupid oath. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening. Verse 23 says, so the Lord delivered Israel on that day, and the battle spread beyond Beit Aven. So the battleground is spreading. These Philistines are running for their lives. These Jewish army men are having to chase the Philistine army, and they're getting tired. This battle's been going on all day. They're exhausted from this. So Yahweh, you see the difference here. Yahweh's given the Israelites this great victory over the Philistine army, but the battle lines are spreading out, and the Jews are having to chase these Philistines. They're exerting a lot of physical energy. They're hungry for food. They need food for energy to continue the fight. And so what do we see through Saul's oath? That no man shall eat until I am avenged. He destroyed his army. He weakened his army on this day. That's all he did, was destroy the men who were to defend him and defend Israel. He weakened the army. This is no leader of men. Now the oath comes into play in verse 24. No food, remember, no food for the Jewish army until Saul has avenged himself. Verse 24 says, now the men of Israel were fatigued. They were hard pressed. On that day, this day of battle, for Saul had put the people under oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food before evening. They're starving. They need food. They've exhausted themselves. They don't have any more energy. They need food to continue. But Saul has said, cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies. So the Bible says here, so none of the people tasted food. I see Saul, and I try to give people in this book the benefit of the doubt, but I see Saul as this crazed control freak who was completely self-absorbed. This was all about him. Look at that. Until I avenge myself. Does Saul have any right to avenge himself? Is that a man's position to avenge himself? Or does God have something to say about avenging someone and vengeance? He's this control freak. He wants to control the army. He wants everything to be about him. So he neglected the health and the needs of his army in order to avenge himself. He is just focused on me, me, me. That's this great king that Israel wanted instead of Yahweh to be their king. So in reality here, what we know is that the Philistines were Yahweh's enemies. They weren't Saul's enemies. This is Satan versus God. This is Dagon versus Yahweh. The Philistines were Yahweh's enemies. They were idolaters, and that's why he wanted them all killed. Time was up. The Philistines are to be destroyed. They weren't Saul's personal enemies the way he wanted it to look. So here you see again this tension of Satan versus God. So I asked the question, does Saul have the personal right to seek vengeance? And I would answer that by saying only in his own eyes. In his own eyes, he believes, I've been wronged, I must be avenged. Not so. Look what the Scripture says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35. I believe that Saul wanted to win this war for his own glory. In his control freak, self-absorbed mind, he thought it would be good to demand that his men not eat until he was avenged. I mean, you'd have to be delirious as a leader of an army to think the best way to lead this army into battle, the best way to ensure victory is to starve my own army. You'd have to be delirious and so self-absorbed. I wonder if Saul ate on this day. Yeah, I bet he did. But not his army. You'd have to be so self-absorbed to be a man thinking like Saul was thinking. I'll starve my army. That'll ensure victory. God says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35, vengeance is mine, not yours, Saul. Not any of yours, and not mine either. God says, vengeance is mine and retribution. In due time, their foot will slip the enemy, for the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. Who takes care of vengeance in this world? God does. He claims it over and over in this book of Leviticus, book of Deuteronomy, in different places. God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. That's what retribution is. God will repay. It's not up to us to be repaid for wrongs against us. God, that's God's authority, God's prerogative. So Saul never submitted here. He never submitted to divine authority. Remember, he even tells the priest, you know what, I've seen enough. I know what I'm going to do. Withdraw your hands. I don't need to talk to Yahweh. He never submitted himself to divine authority, to Yahweh's authority, unless he felt it was to his advantage to do so. That's who Saul was. He always wanted to maintain control over his own life. I see what's going on. I have all the information I need. I don't need to seek Yahweh. I'll do this my way. Oh, I saw a t-shirt. I got to tell you. I saw a t-shirt at Mardell's, the bookstore, the other day that said, Yahweh or the highway. I took a picture of it. I liked it. Yahweh or the highway. It's not my way or the highway, guys, and that's King Saul. King Saul is a my way or the highway guy, and that's not at all right. That's not who we are called to be. It should be God's way or the highway. What God has given us in Scripture is right. That's how we should live, and no other way. That should be our focus in life. It wasn't Saul's. Saul refused to put the will of God above his own personal desires. Can't say it any clearer than that. Saul refused to put the will of God like Jesus did. Nevertheless, let your will, not mine, be done. Saul refused to put the will of God above his own personal desires, and this would cause his downfall. We see it page after page. He even here conjures up a curse against his own army that whoever eats any food before the Philistine army is destroyed would be cursed, or as we'll see soon, killed. Who does that? He has to be out of his mind. Just self-absorbed, and I don't mean insane. I just mean a totally crazed control freak, completely self-absorbed that everything is about me. I'll starve my army to gain glory. Insane. No, I said not insane. Verse 25, he's not insane. He's acting foolishly and not seeking God's will, even when he has the high priest and the ephod there. But when it's to his advantage and it looks good, now let's remember that, when it looks good, Saul's all about Yahweh worship. We'll see it in just a second. All the people of the land entered the forest. So here's God offering this great victory against the Philistines because he's a gracious God. Saul is messing everything up, but God delivers this victory following Jonathan and his armor bearer. And all the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. Who provided that honey? The same God who was providing the victory against this massive army of the Philistines. Remember, it says they numbered like the sand of the seashore. And here we have Saul with 600 men, and God saying, eat. You have to eat. And here's all this honey on the ground. Where does honey come from? It comes from bees. Where do bees come from? They come from God, from the hand, from the providing hand of Almighty God. And so here we see the people enter into the forest, and there was honey on the ground. Here we have Yahweh providing honey. Yahweh, the one that Israel had recently rejected as being their king, providing victory and food for energy. And on the flip side, we have Saul, who the people accepted as their king. Remember the handsome, strong, tall, broad-shouldered Saul. And here we have Yahweh, the irony of it all. Yahweh, the God they rejected, saying, "Hear, my children, take and eat." And we have their king saying, "You shall not eat, or I'll kill you." I wonder if Saul would have allowed the priest to keep his hands in his ephod long enough if God would have said, "I will provide honey for the battle. When you go into the forest, there will be food for you to eat." I wonder if God would have given him any insight as to the way the rest of this day would have gone. But Saul had decided, nope, I have enough information. I'm going to run this my way. All the people see honey on the ground, starving, fatigued, hard-pressed. But for fear of the king that they chose, for fear of the king, no one can be strengthened by the honey. Verse 26, it says, "So when the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath." The people feared the king. Instead of accepting Yahweh's provision, their king had sworn them to an oath that made them not be able to take of Yahweh's provision. This is evil. Whether he meant it as evil or not, an evil act of Saul against his own army. In those days, you didn't disobey a king's oath for fear of severe consequences, even death. But look what it says in verse 27. When Saul made this oath, let me ask you a question. When Saul made the people take this oath that we will not eat until you have been avenged of these enemies, your Philistines. When Saul made the people make that oath, where was Jonathan and his armor bearer? They were gone. They were in the Philistine camp fighting Philistines. They were gone. Jonathan never heard this oath. Jonathan never heard his father, the king, make the army take this oath. And neither did his armor bearer. They weren't there. Verse 27 says, "But Jonathan had not heard," because he wasn't there. Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under oath. Therefore, he, Jonathan, Saul's son, because he was hungry and needed fuel, he put out the end of his staff that was in his hand, and he dipped it in the honeycomb, and he put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. because that's what food does. It gives us strength. So imagine Jonathan here in haste running, not wanting to stop to eat, but he's running along. He has a staff. He puts it into a honeycomb. He gets some honey off of it. While he's chasing the Philistines, he swipes this honey off, and he takes this money to his mouth, this honey, and he eats the honey. It says, and his eyes brightened. Jonathan does what is sensible. Jonathan would have been a great king. Jonathan would have been a great king. Jonathan does here what's sensible. He eats, and it strengthens his body. He is strengthened by the honey that God, Yahweh, provided for him. The sugar in the honey would have provided instant energy. I'm not a biologist, and I'm certainly not a doctor, but you know as well as I do that you need sugar to fuel. It's sugar that becomes glucose that gives us the energy to do things. I read a couple of men that had this idea. You see here that it says, this is an aside, but it might be interesting to a couple of you. It says he put his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. It doesn't say that he was strengthened. It literally says that his eyes were able to see again. So what is it that happens? One of you nurses tell me, not Savannah, you haven't been a nurse long enough. I'm kidding. What happens when you don't have enough, when you go hypoglycemic, when you don't have enough blood sugar? One of the things that physically happens to a human body is that your eyesight starts to darken. I've never experienced this, God knows. I've never experienced low blood sugar. But your eyes start to darken is what people in the know say. So maybe what happened here is maybe Jonathan had low blood sugar because of all his exertion that day, and that God knew that exactly what would be the best energy food for the moment would be honey, because it immediately goes to glucose. It immediately gives the body energy. And so that's why God in His omniscience and brilliance and great grace put honey on the ground. It's not a steak, it's not meat, it's not anything else, it's honey. And honey is great for energy, for sugar, and maybe it's that rise in blood sugar that literally and physically caused his darkening eyes to be brightened. I just thought that was a fascinating turn on what may be happening here. Caleb made some comment when I talked about this yesterday or the day before, and he said, that's funny. What did you say? Sometimes you don't see the people in the Bible as, having real ailments like we had. But I guarantee you there are people in the Bible who had bad knees and high blood sugar and low blood sugar and, all these things. I mean, the ailments were there just like they are now. And here maybe Jonathan had this, maybe his blood sugar went low that day because of all his work. Verse 28 says, then one of the people said, fearing for Jonathan's life here, having witnessed what Jonathan is doing, you can't eat honey. You can't eat anything today. What have you done? One of the people said, your father strictly put the people under oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food today. The people were weary. So this person, whoever it was that spoke up, obviously was worried for Jonathan's safety because of his father, King Saul's foolish oath. We saw you eat, Jonathan. What are we going to do? Your father, the king, has placed us under oath. Verse 29, then Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. He would have been a great king. This is a king's son who in his boldness knows my father has weakened Israel today. And he says it. My father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more, he says, Jonathan, how much more if only the people or the army had eaten freely today of the spoil of the enemies which they found. Not just the honey, but the provisions that the soldiers had on them. What a foolish thing my father has done by saying the army can't eat. He's weakened not only the army, but he's weakened Israel and our ability to defeat God's enemies, the Philistines. That's what he did today. And Jonathan says it out loud. What a courageous man. My father has troubled the land. If only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great, and it won't be great, and we won't continue into this battle because the people are starving and can't fight because of my father. So what happens? The army is starving after a grueling day of battle, chasing the Philistines through these forests. And they, in their appetite, they do something they shouldn't do. They kill the animals left behind by the Philistines in an improper way according to the Jewish law, the law of Moses. In verse 32, and I wonder if they did that because word of Jonathan having eaten had spread out, and they thought, you know what? If I'm going down with Jonathan. He's the only sensible man in the army today, and we're starving. We're going to eat. Verse 32 says, the people rushed greedily upon the spoil. Jonathan has made this proclamation, if only the people would eat of the spoils of the Philistines, the army would have a great victory. And so they did. They took the sheep and the oxen and the calves, the animals, and they slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. You see the problem? With the blood. So I think the picture of what's going on here is in their hunger, they killed quickly. They got these animals onto the ground. They slit their throats to kill them. The animals are in a pool of their own blood. And as they're taking meat off this carcass, it's just drenched in the blood of the animal. It hasn't been drained. So the Jewish army, because of what Saul had ordered, and now Jonathan apparently had freed them from, at least in their own minds, if I'm going down with the great one, Jonathan, our hero today. They were eating the meat with its blood. Just a couple of verses about eating meat with blood. This is an Old Testament thing. This is for Jews. But in Leviticus 17, verse 10, it says, and any man from the house of Israel or from the aliens, the Gentiles who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. Cut him off. Strong language. That doesn't mean I'll leave him out in the wilderness while the Jews go elsewhere. That means if you trace that phrase, Hebrew phrase in the Scripture, I will execute him. He will die. So eating blood is not good. The next verse says, for the life of the flesh. Why won't God allow blood to be eaten? Because the life of the animal, the life of the flesh is in the blood. And I have given it to you on the altar. Why has God given blood? He says there's a use for blood. It's not for eating. It's the life of the animal. And I've given blood to you to make atonement for your souls or for your sins here. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. What does Jesus say the night before He's crucified? He lifts up His cup and He says, this is the blood. This is the, what does He say? This cup represents my blood. And what is He saying but that this cup represents my blood, which represents my life? It says here that blood is given by reason of the life that makes atonement. So Jesus says on the night before He's crucified, I am giving up my blood for you. And what He means is I'm surrendering my life. I'm surrendering my life to you. The very next verse says this, so God has a purpose for blood. It's not to be eaten. God has chosen this blood, the blood of animals, and finally the blood of the Lamb of God to take away the sins of the world. Leviticus 17:12 says, therefore I said to the sons of Israel, no person among you may eat blood, nor may any alien or Gentile who sojourns among you eat blood. It is prohibited. You cannot eat blood as a Jew. And here in Saul's day, you have Saul's army on the ground killing these animals, taking this bloody meat, preparing it somehow. We don't know how they ate it. They may have eaten it raw. We're not told. But the fact of the matter is they were eating the animals with blood. And the simple question is, whose fault is this disaster? Whose fault is it? What had God provided for them to eat on this day? Honey. Honey from the honeycomb. But when Saul said, you can't eat of it, and Jonathan ate of it, and the men changed their minds, we're starving, we're going to eat, all of the fault of this whole disaster lies at the feet of the human king that Israel demanded in place of Yahweh. That's whose fault it was. It was the human king Saul's fault, the king that Israel had demanded to replace Yahweh, who provided the honey. It's such an ironic story. So they told Saul, and they said, behold, the people are sinning. This is an interesting thing. You know, I'm kind of down on Saul right now. I don't want to give him too much credit. But I told you, when it looks good, Saul has an air of spirituality about him. They told Saul, and they said, behold, the people are sinning against Yahweh by eating with the blood. They understood this was wrong. And they said, or Saul said, you have acted treacherously. Interesting that Saul says the Jewish army has acted, not all of them, but some of them have acted treacherously. And Saul demands that a table be made. Roll a great stone to me today. The stone is so the animals can be elevated so you can cut their... it's all so ironic. Does he want them to eat or not? A man not thinking straight. So Saul says, roll a great stone to me so the animals can be lifted up and their blood could drain away. It says it in the next verse. Verse 34, Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, each one of you bring me his ox and his sheep and slaughter it here and eat. So Saul has lifted his no eating ban. Too late now. And he's decided that we cannot sin against Yahweh. When earlier he says to the priest, take your hand out of the Urim and Thummim. No communication needed. I'm going in. It just all appears to be lip service and appealing to the eyes of men, this man Saul. So he wants them to bring their animals and slaughter it there on his large stone so that the blood can properly drain away. It says, and do not sin against Yahweh by eating with the blood. Do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. Great ironic statement in the Bible. That King Saul has the nerve to say, you people are sinning against Yahweh. So Saul says, oh, I'm sorry. So all the people, where am I? So all the people that night brought each one his ox with him, and they slaughtered it there on Saul's table, the great stone. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. Now, this next phrase is very interesting, and it was the first altar that he had built to Yahweh. We don't know how long Saul had been king now, but remember what Noah did. Remember Noah and his boys and their wives were on that boat for just over a year. I think it's like 371 days, just over a year. From the time they went into the ark to the time they actually walked out of the ark was just over a year. Forget the 40 days and 40 nights. That's just how long it rained. They stayed in the boat for just a little bit over a year. And do you remember what the very first thing Noah and his kid and his family did when they left that ark? The very first thing they did was they made an altar out of uncut stones, and they sacrificed to Yahweh who had delivered them. They sacrificed the clean animals that they had brought on the boat to Yahweh. Their very first act was an act of worship to a God that they realized had just saved them in an incredible way. And here we have Saul, after however many, very few years of kingship, but here we have a very interesting look into Saul's spiritual life. This was the first time Saul had built an altar to Yahweh. So I wonder, what did he mean by building the altar? He probably, I'll give him some benefit of the doubt, he probably built the altar to make a sacrifice to Yahweh to atone for the sin of eating the meat with the blood. He knew it was a sin. It was a very high sin to Saul. And so my thought is he probably built the altar to offer animals on it to tell God, hey, we're sorry about eating the blood. It doesn't seem to me that Saul was in the mindset here to simply want to worship Yahweh by building this altar and offering thanksgiving offerings on it for the great victory God had just given them. It doesn't seem to be Saul's thinking on this day. Especially given Saul's motivations. Look what happens in the very next verse. The people are eating, they're killing on his stone. And in the very next verse, on the very same night, Saul says, "We're not finished." He doesn't ask anything from Yahweh. But Saul says, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night and take spoil among them until the morning light." So he wants to fight all night. "And let us not leave a man of them." And finally, he wants to destroy all the Philistines. And the people said to him, "Do whatever seems good to you." So the priest Ahiah has to say, "Wait a minute. Wait a minute, Saul. We need to call on the Lord here." The priest has to stop the king who's just built this altar to worship the living God, right? The priest has to say, we need to draw near to God here. We need to seek the will and the desire of God before we just continue into battle all night. Saul's mind isn't on Yahweh and the will of God. Saul's eager to get back into the battle, but doesn't show any thought for Yahweh's will here. And the priest has to stop Saul and remind him that Yahweh's desire should be sought through the Urim and Thummim. We must draw near to God before we take a step. It's not the king that says that. It was the priest. And we'll pick up right there and see what happens in this story when we come back next week. Let's close in prayer.